Welcome back to the deep dive. So today we're tackling a really pivotal period in American history that stretched between 1933 and 1941.
Yeah, it's a fascinating time. The U.S. is just reeling from the Great Depression,
Yeah.
right, and trying desperately to stay out of the chaos brewing overseas.
Exactly. FDR himself called it an epidemic of world lawlessness, but the instinct at home was very much isolationist. Keep it away.
And what we're going to do in this deep dive using our source material is really trace how the U.S. moved step by step away from that.
To the point where, as the source argues, America had ditched any pretense of neutrality well before Pearl Harbor ever happened in December 41.
That's the core idea. It wasn't one single event, but a slow burn, a series of choices leading towards involvement.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. 1933, FDR comes in, the Depression is raging. What's his foreign policy priority?
Well, that's just it. He barely had one initially. It was completely secondary. His entire focus was on domestic economic recovery,
That's
the New
it.
Deal.
All New Deal all the time.
Pretty much. And you see that crystal clear at the London Economic Conference in the summer of 33.
Right, this big international meeting. What was the goal there?
The goal was to stabilize world currencies, which everyone knew was vital to get global trade going again.
Right.
But Roosevelt, well, he sank it. He torpedoed the whole conference.
Why would stabilizing currency be bad from his perspective?
Because he needed freedom. Freedom to inflate the U.S. currency, to do that gold juggling stuff to raise prices for American farmers, ease debts.
Ah, the domestic agenda.
Exactly. Agreeing to international stabilization would have tied his hands, prevented him from doing what he felt he needed to do at home for the New Deal.
So American farmers won out over global economic cooperation. And the message that sent global...
It was basically every nation for itself. It just poured fuel on the fire of nationalism, isolationism, everywhere. It really set a tone.
Okay, so that's the economic front. This inward focus, how did it play out elsewhere, say, in Asia?
It becomes really visible there. This brings us to what you could call phase one, isolationism, but also, interestingly, good neighborism.
Let's start with Asia. The Tydings-McDuffie Act in 1934. This promised independence to the Philippines by 1946.
Yep. On the surface, it looks generous, but the source material points to, let's say, less noble motives.
Like what?
Congress really wanted two things: to keep out low-wage Filipino workers competing for jobs, and to stop Filipino sugar undercutting American sugar producers.
So it was less about freeing the Philippines and more, as the source says, about America freeing themselves from the Philippines.
That's the analysis, yeah. And you have to think, who was watching this?
Japanese militarists.
Exactly. They saw this as America basically washing its hands of its main foothold in Asia. Kind of a green light for their own expansionist plans.
But it wasn't all withdrawal, was it? FDR did make one big international move around the same time.
Yeah, it's a bit of a contradiction. In 1933, he formally recognized the Soviet Union.
Which was a big deal after years of non-recognition.
Why? Pure pragmatism, really. Hope for trade, maybe.
Yeah.
But also, importantly, the idea was to maybe build up the USSR as a counterweight to Germany and Japan, who were clearly becoming threats. A friendly face, potentially.
Interesting. Okay, let's shift hemispheres. The good neighbor policy towards Latin America. What was that about?
This was a major shift. FDR committed to renouncing armed intervention, the old big stick approach. And it wasn't just talk.
What were the actions?
Well, you see, the last Marines leaving Haiti in 34. The U.S. eased up on the Platt Amendment that gave it intervention rights in Cuba, also in 34.
Though, crucially, we kept the Guantanamo Bay naval base lease, right?
Yes, definitely kept Guantanamo. And then relaxed the U.S. grip on Panama in 36. Real steps were taken.
But the real test, the source says, was Mexico.
Absolutely. 1938, the Mexican government seizes U.S. oil company properties. American investors are furious, demanding intervention.
Like the old days. Send in the troops.
Right. But Roosevelt resisted. He held firm against that pressure, negotiated instead, and eventually got a settlement by 1941.
And the payoff.
Huge goodwill in Latin America. That solidarity became incredibly important later when war actually broke out. It paid off.
Okay, so while political isolationism is strong, there's this interesting economic countercurrent with the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act of 1934.
Yes, this is Secretary of State Cordell Hull's big project. His philosophy was simple. Trade is a two-way street. And trade wars, well, they often lead to shooting wars.
He wanted to lower tariffs, right, after the disastrously high Hawley-Smoot tariff.
Exactly. But the genius of this act was how it did it. It gave FDR the power to lower those Hawley-Smoot rates by up to 50%.
without needing Senate approval for every single trade deal.
That's the key. It bypassed the whole congressional log-rolling nightmare, where senators traded votes to protect their local industries with high tariffs. It moved power to the executive.
That sounds like a massive change in how things were done.
It was revolutionary. It reversed a policy that went back basically to the Civil War, and it really laid the groundwork for the entire free trade system the U.S. championed after World War II, a landmark piece of legislation.
But while Hull's trying to build trade bridges, the world situation is getting darker. Phase 2. The dictators rise, and America retreats further into legislation.
Yeah, by the mid-30s, the threats are unmistakable. You've got Stalin consolidating power in the USSR, Mussolini in Italy since 22, Hitler in Germany since 33.
And Hitler pulls Germany out of the League of Nations in 33. Then the Rome-Berlin axis forms in 36.
And the aggression starts. Mussolini attacks Ethiopia in 1935. This was a real test for the League of Nations.
Could they stop it?
They could have, maybe.
Hmm.
The analysis suggests if they'd imposed a meaningful oil embargo on Italy, Mussolini's war machine might have ground to a halt.
But they didn't.
No. They hesitated, they failed. And that failure basically told Hitler and Mussolini that the international community wouldn't or couldn't stop them. The League's credibility was shot.
And back in the U.S., how are people feeling about all this and about the last war?
Deeply disillusioned. You get the Nye Committee investigation starting in 34.
The merchants of death theory.
Exactly. This idea, which the source suggests was an oversimplification, that bankers and arms makers had pushed the U.S. into World War I for profit. It created huge cynicism.
And that cynicism translates directly into law, right?
Absolutely. It fuels the Neutrality Acts of 1935, 36, and 37. These were Congress's attempt to legislate America out of the next war.
What did they basically say?
In essence,
Huh.
once the president declares a foreign war exists, Americans couldn't sail on ships of warring nations, couldn't sell or transport weapons to them, couldn't make loans to them. Watertight rules, they hoped.
But the source is quite critical of these acts, calls them one war too late.
Yes, the argument is they abandoned traditional American principles like freedom of the seas. And worse, they made no distinction between the aggressors, Hitler, Mussolini, and their victims.
So by treating everyone the same.
They effectively helped the dictators, who were already armed and aggressive, against the democracies who might need help later. It was a neutrality that wasn't really neutral in its effect.
And the Spanish Civil War becomes a tragic case study of this.
Painfully so. 1936 to 39. You have the democratically elected Loyalist government fighting against the fascist General Franco.
Who's getting tons of help from Hitler and Mussolini.
Right. And what does the U.S. do? Congress, with FDR's sort of quiet approval, applies the arms embargo to both sides.
Cutting off the democratic government from potential aid.
Exactly. It was, in effect, condemning a fellow democracy, a terrible signal to the dictators, although we should mention the Americans who defied this, like the volunteers in the Abraham Lincoln Brigade who went to fight Franco.
So by 1937, this neutrality policy is already looking problematic. Then Japan invades China fully.
Right. Now, FDR has a dilemma. If he officially calls this a declared war, the Neutrality Acts kick in, and all aid to China stops.
Which he doesn't want.
No. So he plays this clever political game. He just doesn't call it a declared war. He refuses to invoke the acts.
Which allows some munitions to still trickle through to the Chinese.
While Japan, ironically, could still buy huge amounts of American scrap metal, oil, other supplies, because technically there was no war declared. It was a loophole.
This maneuvering leads him to give that famous speech in Chicago in 37, the quarantine speech.
Yeah, where he suggests maybe the peace-loving nations need to quarantine the aggressors, probably meaning economic embargoes.
How did that go down?
Like a lead balloon. The isolationist backlash was immediate and fierce. FDR had to quickly backtrack and clarify. It showed just how powerful that isolationist sentiment still was.
Even after Japan actually sank a U.S. gunboat, the Panay, later that year.
Even then, America basically accepted Japan's quick apology and payment, anything to avoid being dragged into conflict. The desire to stay out was incredibly strong.
Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Hitler just keeps pushing.
Relentlessly. Compulsory military service in 35, marches into the Rhineland in 36, snaps up Austria in 38, and the response from Britain and France. Appeasement.
Culminating in the Munich Conference, September 1938.
Where Britain and France essentially hand over the Sudetenland part of Czechoslovakia to Hitler, hoping it will satisfy him. Peace in our time, Chamberlain famously said.
Which lasted how long?
About 6 months. Then Hitler took the rest of Czechoslovakia in March 39. Appeasement was clearly a failure.
And amidst all this geopolitical maneuvering, there's a growing humanitarian crisis that isolationism is making worse.
Yes, the persecution of Jews in Germany is escalating dramatically, especially after Kristallnacht in November 1938. But America's doors remain largely shut.
Because of those restrictive immigration laws passed in the isolationist 20s.
Exactly, rooted in fear, xenophobia. The source highlights the tragic story of the ship St. Louis in May 39.
Filled with Jewish refugees fleeing Germany.
Almost 1,000 of them. They get close to the U.S. coast, but they're turned away because of those quota laws. Forced to return to Europe, where sadly many later died in the Holocaust. It's a stark reminder of the moral cost.
Then comes the bombshell that shatters any remaining illusions about alliances. August 1939.
The Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. Hitler and Stalin, sworn enemies, make a deal.
Which basically gives Hitler a green light to invade Poland without fearing a Soviet attack from the east.
And he does, September 1st, 1939. World War II officially begins.
How does America react now? Still determined to stay out?
Overwhelmingly anti-Nazi, yes, but still desperate to avoid war. This leads to a revision of the neutrality laws, the Neutrality Act of 1939.
What's the change?
This introduces cash and carry.
Okay, explain that.
Democracies, meaning Britain and France really, could now buy American war materials. But they had to pay in cash up front, and they had to transport the goods on their own ships.
Why did that instantly favor Britain and France?
Because they controlled the Atlantic sea lanes, Germany couldn't get ships across to buy things, so it was a way to help the Allies while still maintaining a sort of technical neutrality.
And it also helped the U.S. economy.
Big time. Factories started getting huge orders. It helped pull the U.S. further out of the Depression.
Then comes the spring and summer of 1940. The phony war ends.
And how? Germany blitzes through Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium. And then the real shock. The fall of France in June 1940.
A globe-shaking event, the source calls it.
Absolutely. It stunned Americans. Britain was now standing alone against Hitler. The Battle of Britain began.
And this finally shapes America out of its apathy.
It seems so. Preparedness ramps up hugely. Congress approves a massive $37 billion for military buildup. And in September 1940, the U.S. enacts its first ever peacetime draft.
The nation is clearly getting ready, just in case.
And the policy shifts towards all aid short of war, which leads to the destroyer deal in September 1940.
Tell us about that. 50 old warships for bases.
Yeah, FDR transfers 50 World War I-era destroyers to the desperate British Navy. In return, the U.S. gets leases for naval bases on British territories in the Western Hemisphere, from Newfoundland down to South America.
Now, was this legal? Was it neutral?
Well, it was done by presidential executive agreement, bypassed Congress entirely, and neutral, not remotely. It was a clear act of siding with Britain.
And the isolationists?
Furious. Groups like the America First Committee screamed that this was basically an act of war, dragging the U.S. in. But FDR did it anyway. It showed how far things had shifted.
This brings us into 1940-41, Phase 4. America becomes the arsenal of democracy, and there's an election.
Yes, 1940. FDR decides to run for an unprecedented third term against the Republican Wendell Willkie.
That broke a long tradition. How did voters react?
Despite the two-term tradition being a hurdle, the source suggests voters sensed the global danger. They chose the experienced leader, FDR. It was almost like Hitler was the unspoken opponent on the ballot.
And soon after the election comes perhaps the most significant step short of war.
The Lend-Lease Act, March 1941, Patriot Act number 1776, very symbolic.
What was the core idea here? Send guns, not sons.
Exactly. Get rid of the dollar sign that had caused so many problems with war debts after WWI.
Yeah.
America would lend or lease arms and supplies to any nation whose defense was deemed vital to U.S. security. Basically, Britain.
Making America the arsenal of democracy.
That was the phrase. Isolationists hated it, called it the blank check bill, argued it would bankrupt the country and inevitably lead to war.
But it passed, and its significance.
It was enormous. An economic declaration of war, really. It formally abandoned any shred of neutrality and committed America's industrial might to defeating the Axis powers. U.S. factories went into overdrive for war production.
Then another massive shock changes the whole equation again. June 1941.
Hitler invades the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa, another globe-shaking event.
And FDR's reaction?
Immediately offers Lend-Lease aid to Stalin. Ultimately, the Soviets would receive about $11 billion worth.
Helping a communist dictatorship, how did that sit?
It was pure pragmatism. Yes, there was some cynical talk, like Senator Truman reportedly saying, let the Nazis and commies kill each other off. But the main strategy was, anyone fighting Hitler is helping the United States. Enemy of my enemy.
And this growing Anglo-American cooperation is formalized in August 1941.
Right. The secret meeting between Roosevelt and Churchill on a warship off Newfoundland. They issued the Atlantic Charter,
What was that?
an 8-point declaration outlining their goals for a post-war world. Things like self-determination for nations, disarmament, freedom from fear and want, a permanent system of general security. It was basically a statement of shared democratic aims.
So America is supplying Britain and now the Soviet Union. Those supplies have to cross the Atlantic, which is full of German U-boats.
Exactly. So protecting those shipments becomes necessary. FDR orders the U.S. Navy to escort Lend-Lease convoys halfway across the Atlantic to Iceland.
Which inevitably leads to conflict.
Inevitably, you get clashes. The U.S. destroyer Greer is attacked in September 41, leading FDR to issue a shoot-on-sight order against German submarines.
The shooting war in the Atlantic has basically started.
Unofficially, yes. Then the destroyer Kearney is crippled, and the Reuben James is sunk, with heavy loss of American life.
How does Congress respond to actual American ships being sunk?
They finally act in mid-November 1941. They vote to repeal parts of the Neutrality Act, allowing merchant ships to be armed and to sail into combat zones. It's a recognition that the undeclared naval war is already happening.
So the focus has been heavily on the Atlantic, but the final blow comes from the Pacific. What's happening with Japan?
Japan is feeling squeezed. The U.S. has imposed increasingly tough embargoes, cutting off vital supplies like oil and scrap metal, trying to pressure them to stop their war in China.
So Japan's leaders feel cornered.
Pretty much. They see two options: give in to U.S. demands, which seems like humiliating capitulation, or launch a desperate strike to seize the resources they need, especially oil from the Dutch East Indies.
Washington knew something was coming, right? They'd broken Japanese codes.
Yes, they knew war was imminent. They expected an attack, but thought it would likely be against British Malaya or the Philippines. Pearl Harbor in Hawaii wasn't seen as the primary target.
But on December 7th, 1941,
While Japanese diplomats were still talking in Washington, seemingly prolonging negotiations, the surprise attack happens. Japanese bombers hit Pearl Harbor.
the damage.
Devastating. Around 3,000 American casualties. Most of the U.S. battleship fleet was sunk or badly damaged. Critically, though, the 3 U.S. aircraft carriers based there happened to be out at sea and escaped destruction.
And the political impact.
Instant unity. Congress declared war on Japan the very next day, December 8th, with only one dissenting vote. 3 days later, Japan's allies, Germany and Italy, declared war on the United States. The U.S. was fully in World War II. But the key takeaway from the source material here is the paradox. Yes, Pearl Harbor unified the country like nothing else could.
But it wasn't the cause of U.S. involvement in the way people sometimes think.
Exactly. It was the final catalyst, the last explosion in a long chain reaction. The chain reaction was all those unneutral steps taken before. The destroyer deal, Lend-Lease, the Atlantic Charter, the undeclared naval war. The U.S. had already chosen its side and was engaged in economic warfare long before the bombs fell.
So recapping this whole journey, America starts deeply isolationist, scarred by WWI and the Depression. They try to legislate neutrality with acts that prove flawed.
Right. Then, faced with unchecked aggression threatening democracy itself, FDR, often through executive action, slowly pivots the country towards aiding the Allies.
Cash and carry, the destroyer deal, Lend-Lease, each step moving further from neutrality, making America the arsenal of democracy. Economic war becomes inevitable.
Until Pearl Harbor provides the final, unavoidable push into full military conflict.
It leaves you thinking, doesn't it, about how that initial intense desire to avoid repeating World War I's perceived mistakes
Led to policies like the Neutrality Acts, which were so rigid, so blind to the difference between aggressor and victim.
that they perhaps inadvertently made the situation worse, delayed a more decisive stance, and forced the U.S. to play catch-up when the global crisis became undeniable. How did trying so hard not to make the WWI mistake contribute, in its own way, to making WWII an even bigger, more dangerous conflict for democracy worldwide?
That's something to really ponder. Thank you for diving deep with us today.